Okay, Ivor, you are an authority on narrative theory, and you've been influential in highlighting life history and narrative pedagogy and narrative research. Why have these perspectives on research and education been so important to you?
I suppose to answer that, you've got to break down the answer a bit in terms of different historical periods. So, I mean, we're now living in a moment of AI, of huge change, of attacks on universities, of a kind of attempt to disenfranchise people's lives in a way and take over control by the market and various other regimes. And AI, of course, will rapidly transform that. So we're in a perilous moment in terms of how people understand themselves through research methods or self-study or whatever. It's a transitional moment. If you go back in time to when life history was first mooted, which really goes back to Chicago in the 30s, you're dealing with an active social democracy with an articulate citizenry, with newspapers that were not saturated by control mechanisms, with decent newspapers, a whole range of civic society that you could lock into when you did narrative work or life history work. In other words, the narratives were already existing, they were enfranchised, they were empowered. Over time, as society changes from a social democratic society to what we might call, or Sandel calls, a market society, the locus of power changes, and instead of enhancing, exhorting and enfranchising people's narratives, the emphasis at the moment is on distortion, suppression and general misinformation. You've got to remember that the world system that we have at the moment ensures two things. It ensures degraded services for everybody and demeaning work for most people. So that's not a system which is likely to be applauded if truth and information are allowed there. So the answer to the creation of this appalling system is to create fake news, misinformation, and a focus and displacement onto other issues, such as migrants or any other scapegoat they can use, instead of any focus on the actual systemic reality of the world. So in such a situation, narratives are much more contested than before, but also much more needed than before. So you have the two things in a strange moment. There's an attempt to suppress them, but they're more needed than ever to contest this emergent reality.
I find that educational research often is detached and quite irrelevant to teachers' life and work. In what way do you think connects your research to the teacher's life?
I think you're right that in a way, for a long time, there's been a disconnect between educational research and teachers' working lives. But I think in some ways that disconnect has been exacerbated by the kind of changes that we talked about at the beginning here, which is that as you can see it in the attempt to control universities in America at the moment, there's an increasing attempt to control all of the curriculum and all of the discourses which constitute education. And one of the ways that plays out, that insistence on the rhetoric of governance and the rhetoric of the market, is an attempt to suppress any conversations about the kind of working lives of teachers, or indeed the life missions of teachers, because often the working conditions of teachers and their beliefs and their mission are at odds with the kind of reforms which are being promulgated. So what you see when you're asking for research to be done on narratives of teachers' lives, or narratives of teachers' working conditions, or narratives of teachers' life missions, you're asking for a different set of criteria about education for those which those in governance may want. What they are saying, I mean, if you read Malinowski's book about postmodernism, he says that the current aspiration of education is the systematic production of ignorance. And you can see that to some extent when universities like Harvard or other elevated institutions are under attack for trying to promote a broad educational canvas. What is wanted by governance is a very narrow canvas, and one that does not question foreign policy, does not question the logic of the society as it is. So by focusing one's research on narrative, you're giving voice to a different constituency and actually a different set of concerns. And I would say that constituency and those concerns are very much rooted in the notion of human beings as humane and compassionate and caring, rather than transactional and the opposite of caring, whatever that is. So you're not only enfranchising a different narrative, you're enfranchising a whole worldview of what it is desirable for humanity to aim at. At the moment, it's clear that the aims that are being promulgated are anti-humane in a way. They're certainly anti-humane in all of the subordinate groups, but they're anti-humane in terms of the failure to confront war and the failure to confront systemic violence, whether it be gender violence or social violence. All of those things are being ignored by forces of governance and vested interests, whereas what focus on people's own humanity gives you is a line onto why people continue to wish to be tolerant and compassionate and caring. That remains still a predominant human wish, but it's suppressed and perverted at the moment. So by focusing on narratives, you're seeking a different kind of truth, and I would say a truth that's much closer to the way human beings are actually constituted than the rather perverted version that we're given. So actually the battle over narrative research it's not to overstate it, it is in small terms a battle for the future of a humanistic vision of the world.
How would you say doing narrative research might differ in various or different cultures? Does it make a difference?
It makes a huge difference, and the reason I'm fairly attuned to it at the moment is because it's a funny process when you go through the translation of your books into other languages, because you're not only translating the word, you're translating the cultural connotations of the word. So I've been spending a lot of time recently actually doing Zoom lectures, but also retranslating work for China, Japan and Brazil, where the narrative methods are huge. And so just to give you an example of how culturally different it is, I was in Shanghai to give some lectures, and I went with Mary walking along what's called the Bund in Shanghai. It's the beautiful waterfront, and everybody was taking pictures of their self in selfies. And I got talking to two of them who happened to be students at the University of Peking, as it was, and Beijing now. I said to them, when you see this picture, what do you see? Because of course the traditional cultural meaning of selfhood and life in China was the party belief that there is no such thing as the private self, only the collective self. And that of course is true in Japanese culture as well. There's a preeminence given to the collective making decisions, and individual decisions are thought to be certainly less meaningful and less kind of influential. So once you change the technology and people are taking selfhoods, the question to ask is, what are they seeing when they see the self? Because what they've been told is that there is only a collective self, there is no private self. But what you're seeing in that self is a private self, whether you like it or not. So, not surprisingly, as they discover the private self through the new technology and through everything else, social media, everything else, you're discovering a private self as your voice. What they're discovering is that the method which is most transformative and consequential for them is actually the narrative method. Hence, the last 5 books I've done in narrative have all been published in China very rapidly because of this interest. So partly it's been explaining to myself why the books are going well in China or Japan. It's to do with this transformation in those cultures of the vision of selfhood and life narrative, which was previously so different. If you take the translation into Brazil, then it goes back to my answer to the previous question. Brazil is one of the last countries, I would say, that's managed to keep a vital social democracy going. You can see that in sending Bolsonaro to jail. They have reasserted the power of civic society to govern misinformation and untruth by sending him to jail. It's very unpopular with some politicians that they've done so. But what it shows you is you have a society which is still, in quotes, democratic, which has still got a civic society, which is still social democratic. Their narrative methods fit into a general pattern of civic enfranchisement. And so there you're working with the grain of society. In other societies, you're working against the grain of society, or in the case of China and Japan, you're working with the emergent sense of selfhood in the society. So to answer your question, in each situation, the narrative is placed in a different positionality to the way that the society is going. And the role of the researcher or public intellectual is to recognize the differential angles at which narrative research operates. If you don't do that and you just, as we were saying earlier, you just promote a Western vision of life narratives without any sensitivity to the totally different context of selfhood in other societies, it's an act of colonization which completely misses the point of social understanding. So,
Ivor, what would you say modern technology is? How do you view modern technology in educational research at the moment and for the future?
I mean, the thing about it is that we're facing a fast-moving target, aren't we? So, I mean, the answer a year ago would probably have been for me to focus on the significance of digitalization and computerization and social media and the various ways that transforms the way people voice themselves, express themselves, perform themselves. In a way, we're moving now to a fast-changing situation of automated and artificial intelligence. We're going into the AI period. I mean, you can see the significance of that already, can't you, in terms of our work as university professors, that actually people are providing us with a voice which is written by others. It's only a step away now from people's self-generated life stories being generated elsewhere. I mean, the disenfranchisement that is involved in that is epic. It means that you no longer are the author of your own life. You lose all of the agency which certainly in Western societies, people have taken for granted. And you hand over not only your voice to be generated elsewhere, but your worldview, your opinions, your vision of humanity are all mediated and arbitrated elsewhere by a machine. That poses the most huge questions about the nature of research. I mean, one way, I've said this several years ago, but one way that one would position research now would be to kick it up a few gears from just being kind of life narrative work to actually asking the incredible question of what is the nature of human beingness now in a world where AI and social media predominate? Is it actually transforming the nature of human beingness, and specifically, is it changing the nature of human subjectivity? Because the key question always about life history work and narrative work was that it, instead of trying to present an objectivist, positivist view of the world, it was trying to tap in to the subjectivist view of the world. To quote W.I. Thomas, if people believe something to be true, it is true in its consequences. In other words, the subjective reality of people is in fact their truth, and it's what they operate upon. We're now seeing a world where that subjectivity is being legislated, implemented and mediated by other forces who have other agendas. And so it's an absolutely seismic transformation in the emancipation of human beingness and the enlightenment of human beingness. It's reversing the process that's been going on since the Enlightenment. It's reversing it the most stark way that one can possibly imagine. And I would reckon it's transforming the nature of human subjectivity. We can see it in all the political explosions which nobody can understand all around the world. These imply a transformation of subjectivity and a control of subjectivity by forces other than the self.
What advice would you give your younger self, Ivor?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think I always suspected that the forces of what we might call governance were not universally committed, shall we say, to the well-being and emancipation of the population. But I thought as a younger self that this was maybe just a historical moment or a failure of understanding, and that with a degree more of understanding, those forces would begin to work for human well-being. I think I would tell my younger self to be more suspicious of governance and patterns of reform and ideologies generally, whether they be communism or capitalism. I would be more interested in local patterns of emancipation and governance, and less concerned with believing in the benevolence of the governing forces and the corporate forces in the society. I think they're not working for our well-being, and I should have known that much earlier.